Hey everybody, this is Tripp, and we're trying a little experiment. We're going to be sharing publicly two amazing lectures, and it is by the authors of this book, Baptizing America: How Mainline Protestantism Helped Build Christian Nationalism. Brian and Beau will be tag teaming these two lectures. This is the first one. And in this lecture, they're looking at the background, the foundation, the origins, the way in which what we're experiencing now of Christian nationalism started to get formed. And you're going to dig it. And then you're going to go check out this book because it's awesome. And you're invited to join us on May 30th when they join live. You can send in your questions. It's going to be fun. And if this conversation gets you pumped, if it gets you hyped, if it makes you think like, I got to think about this more, I got to wrestle with this, I just went and got the book and I'm thinking about it, then join the next homebrewed open online class. Kicks off this June. Faith in Politics for the Rest of Us. My friends Diana Butler Bass and Tim Whitaker from the New Evangelicals are helping me put it together. We got 6 different scholars bringing other lectures like you're about to experience, and it's donation based, including zero. So if you want to hang out on the internet with thousands of other people asking us questions, if you want some videos where you can drop them, use them maybe in a small group discussion group, or do it on your own, if you want to join live streams with a whole bunch of people where we talk, wrestle, question what it's like to engage in a public square when we don't want to do the ugly version but aren't sure exactly what it looks like, then come on out. faithinpolitics.net. And I hope you enjoy Brian and Beau's first lecture.
Welcome to this session, Baptizing America: How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism. I'm Brian Kaylor. I'm a Baptist minister with a PhD in political communication, and I serve as president and editor-in-chief of Word and Way, which is a Christian media outlet that's been around since 1896.
And I'm Beau Underwood. I'm a Disciples of Christ pastor, a contributing editor at Word and Way, and I've also been doing doctoral work in public affairs. Alongside Brian, I'm the co-author of Baptizing America: How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism, which is now out from Chalice Press. This got started for us as a project when we first wrote a piece for Religion and Politics about the ways that mainline Protestants had helped create the soil in which contemporary expressions of Christian nationalism had grown. It was really rooted in this conviction that we couldn't understand where we're at today when it comes to Christian nationalism without understanding the role of mainline Protestants in it historically and the way we still perpetuate this problem today. So we're excited to talk with you a little bit about how we think we got here in terms of the historical effort, and then what we think we can do in response to Christian nationalism in our churches and our communities right now.
So a few months ago, you probably saw this moment. There was a Bible moment that got a lot of attention. Former President Donald Trump announced that he was helping sell the God Bless the USA Bible. On the cover of the Bible, there's the American flag. If you open it up, you'll find the United States Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, the Pledge of Allegiance, as well as the lyrics to, of course, Lee Greenwood's patriotic anthem, God Bless the USA. Greenwood's been selling the Bible for a couple of years and has now paid Trump to be essentially a celebrity spokesperson for the Bible. It sparked a lot of criticism and condemnation and late night jokes, but also a lot of commentators acknowledged that it was probably a smart move. It will sell some Bibles, make Greenwood and Trump some money, because Trump was playing to his evangelical base with this move. And while it got a lot of attention, and it brought a lot of criticism, as well as some praise from some evangelicals happy to go and order the $60 version of the Bible, it's not the first time we've seen such a moment.
No, it's not. But Brian, before you get there, I just got to say, to me, the most obscene thing about this, and there's a lot of obscene things about this, is the fact that this was not just any version of the Bible, but it was the King James version of the Bible. So we're selling a USA God and Country Bible that was the translation from King James.
Yeah, God bless the USA, but long live the king.
You can't make this up.
But before Trump hawked the Bible, another president was involved in helping bless and sell a Bible. President Harry Truman, as a native Missourian. There we go. We've got President Truman right there. This is a moment that occurs in 1952 in a ceremony at the Rose Garden at the White House. The National Council of Churches had produced a new translation of the Bible, the Revised Standard Version, and they wanted to celebrate its launch And so they get themselves a White House ceremony so that they get the presidential stamp of approval. It brings attention and this official blessing to their translation that I'm sure helped sell some Bibles as well. President Truman was happy to be a part of it. He welcomed the Bible, accepted that very first copy that rolled off the printing press, and talked about how the Bible guided his foreign policy and, in fact, matched with American foreign policy goals and ideals. And while we probably focus on Truman because he's the one that we know in that picture, I actually think the story of the other man there holding the Bible is the most important and most fascinating. That's Dr. Luther Weigel. He was a Yale Divinity School professor. He was the head of the translation effort from the National Council of Churches. It's important to remember that the National Council of Churches had started with a leadership from a lot of the mainline traditions. And at the time, particularly in the 50s, the leadership of the NCC largely came from mainline Protestant leaders. And Dr. Weigel is no exception. He's a minister in two different traditions, today known as the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and the United Church of Christ. He was a representative of America's religious elites, right? This minister, this professor, and this Bible translator. And so there he is getting to hand off the product to President Truman. But his story doesn't end there. This is a significant enough moment in, say, the world of Christian nationalism. And let's just call it that, even though that's a term that was not in vogue at the time. Because if Donald Trump had been involved in a ceremony like this, I mean, but we know exactly what would have happened if we had had a Rose Garden ceremony during the Trump presidency to celebrate a new Bible.
Yeah, there would have been a lot of outrage, but in reality, there's one thing going on in both instances, right? Here you have a political leader blessing a Bible, and that blessing was sought out by religious leaders who needed or who thought that the political leader would provide legitimacy to their biblical project. And so, if that was Christian nationalism today when Donald Trump was doing it, it had to be Christian nationalism back in 1952 when Harry Truman was doing it. And we really need to ask why, right? Why do we look to political leaders for that legitimacy when it comes to the way we practice our Christian faith and the symbols that we use to, represent our Christian faith? There's something similar going on despite the expanse of time that's really important to be named here.
That's right. And Dr. Weigel, I think, represents and shows us how Christian nationalism was at play among mainline religious elites like himself back there in the 50s and 60s. A few years after this photo, a few years after this moment, he testifies in a court case that eventually goes all the way to the United States Supreme Court, School District of Abington Township, Pennsylvania v. Shemp. The name is probably familiar to a lot of those of you who are listening to this presentation. It's one of the, quote, infamous God got kicked out of school cases, right? This one is the second year in 1963 that ended the compulsory Bible study, Bible reading in public schools coming out of Pennsylvania, though it was a practice elsewhere as well. And so I said he had testified before it got to the Supreme Court as an expert witness for the public school. He testified on behalf of the practice, arguing that public school children should be required to join in on the reading of the Bible and the Lord's Prayer to start their days at school. And that he argued that this was exactly what it meant to be an American. And so we need to help train up the kids in understanding this. After the United States Supreme Court said otherwise, he criticized that ruling publicly and spent the last few years of his life advocating for Congress to pass a constitutional amendment to allow official government prayers and Bible reading in public schools. This is how he put it in a letter to the House Judiciary Committee in 1964, as he argued for such a constitutional amendment. The state cannot be neutral as to God, the creator and sustainer of our being. Here, neutrality is equivalent to denial. So we have wrapped up right here someone who represents a lot of what we could call Christian nationalism today, but he wasn't coming from white evangelical traditions. He wasn't a Trumpian. This is a problem that predates what we're facing in our current political moment.
Yeah, that's right, Brian. We just, I think, need to again name the underlying assumption, right? Which is that what's good for our tradition, whether it's the mainline church or the evangelical church, what we think is good for us, we also think is good for the country. And it's kind of exposing that lie, right? That assumption that American identity and Christian identity always go together well, whether that's put forth by mainliners or by evangelicals, that our continued conversation about Christian nationalism is all about. Now, this brings to the question, right? Who are mainline Protestants? Some of you watching this are going to go, well, of course I know who they are. I'm one of them, right? And others of you are going to go, yeah, this phrase that you've been using doesn't make any sense to me. Help me explain that. Help unpack that. What we have before us is the Washington National Cathedral, one of the most prominent religious structures in all of American society. If you've lived in Washington, D.C. or visited Washington, D.C., you can almost always see it from the skyline wherever you're at in the city. And it's a place that has hosted lots of different events of national significance, from religious events to presidential speeches to inauguration events. It is a gathering place where civil religion is practiced. And it's also a sacred place where a Christian community gathers regularly for worship that was built and continues to be shepherded by the Episcopal Church, a mainline Protestant denomination. And this building itself shows how mainline Protestants kind of have seen themselves at the center of American religious life just by its prominence, right? So you might be a mainline Protestant if you belong to one of 7 different denominations. One of the ways we identify religious identity in social science is by religious belonging. And there is this thing called the 7 Sisters of the Mainline, which are the 7 denominations traditionally connected to mainline Protestants. That would be the American Baptist churches in the USA, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, the ELCA, the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, the United Church of Christ, and the United Methodist Church. So one way of understanding who mainliners are is simply saying anybody who belongs to one of those 7 traditions is a mainline Protestant.
And then, of course, the definition has broadened. I mean, the 7 are significant. They've been culturally, politically, religiously important denominations in American life since before the country was founded in many cases. And yet there are also other traditions today considered a mainline Protestant. So you might also be a mainline Protestant, even if you're not one of those 7. We see, for instance, with Pew and other researchers today, they code a number of denominations. And again, focusing on this idea of belonging, really look at in the Protestant world, you're either part of a white evangelical denomination, you're part of a white mainline denomination, or you're part of a historically Black Protestant denomination. And so that's really important to recognize that white mainline Protestants are still significant, not in the same way that they were in the 1950s and 60s and before that era. But PRI and some others that have been doing research with this classification are now finding that because of the decline among white evangelicals, that those 2 groups now, white evangelical and white mainline, are about the same size. And PRI actually for the last few years has white mainline Protestants as slightly larger tradition. But either way, you're talking today at about half of the white Protestant world would fall into the mainline Protestant camp. But our news coverage doesn't always do that, right? It always focuses much more on evangelicals. And so we think it's important to spend some more time thinking about mainline Protestants today, not just in the past.
That's right. And I do think that there's an even better way than just religious belonging to think about who's a mainline Protestant. So here we draw on the research of David Hollinger, an American religious historian, who really talks of mainline Protestants as being more ecumenically minded. They tend to be the Christians who are willing to kind of cross traditional denominational boundaries. The Christians less concerned about getting into doctrinal fights before we can figure out how to work together. We don't all have to believe the same thing. And those who have been more open-minded when it comes to accepting the findings of modern science and modern understandings of the Bible, right? So if you kind of think of those Christians that are more open to scientific progress and how we integrate that into the Christian faith versus pushing back against it, and how we are willing to accept the findings of sort of modern historical critical understandings of the Bible, those would be your mainline Protestants. Now, that's still painting with a pretty broad brush. There's no easy or clean way to say who's in and who's out when it comes to some of these categories. There's some fluidity there, but that's a different way of thinking about who falls into this category. And again, this is a group of Christians that has been very, very significant in the history and unfolding of American religious life.
So let's talk a little bit then about how we think that mainline Protestants helped build Christian nationalism. And perhaps one of the most significant examples is to recognize that under God is now in the Pledge of Allegiance. It wasn't there initially when it was first written. It's commonly credited to a Baptist socialist minister. We don't always put those two words together, but he was not just an attack of his opponents. He was a proud socialist, an American Baptist minister, and God was left out of the pledge from the beginning and stays that way for decades. And it all changes in 1954, 70 years ago, because of one sermon, the influence of one sermon. And you can see that moment here from the church service that day with the Reverend George Dockery. He's a Presbyterian pastor at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. And he knew that that guy next to him, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, was going to be in church that day because it was Lincoln Sunday, February 7th, close to Lincoln's birthday. And presidents have often visited the church there on that Sunday. So as he's preparing his sermon, knowing that President Eisenhower will be sitting in the pew, a reserved particular pew for the president, Reverend Dockery decided to preach essentially to an audience of one. The rest of the congregation got to hear the sermon, but he had one person in mind that he particularly wanted to focus his message on for that day. And the argument was that the nation needed to put God into the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, he makes arguments that today would seem quite familiar to us if we listen to the way white conservative evangelicals talk about America. He frames the United States' founding as based on America. He defines the American way of life as based on the Ten Commandments and the words of Jesus of Nazareth, the living word of God for the world. And then he notes that there's a problem. God isn't in it. So that he says you could almost even hear someone over in Moscow saying this pledge to their flag. And that gets us to a really important point here. A lot of what's happening during the wave of Christian nationalism that we see in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s was in response to the, quote, atheistic, godless communism. Right? So a way of marking our nation as blessed by God. God is on our side to reassure us that we will win in this global struggle. And what's amazing about his sermon, besides the impact that it has, is that Reverend Dockery says the quiet part out loud. In his sermon, he specifically notes, though, that, well, okay, so there's some people that wouldn't be able to pledge to being under God because they don't believe in God. And then this is his response after admitting this potential dilemma. Philosophically speaking, an atheistic American is a contradiction in terms. And then he later added, they really are spiritual parasites. And this is what he's arguing in the sermon, that if you don't believe in God, you're not really fully American. That's Christian nationalism, this confusion of American and Christian identities. He makes the argument, and President Eisenhower is convinced. Members of Congress are convinced. They're rushing to file bills to get credit for it. The media are playing clips from his sermon. It's printed in the congressional record. And Beau and I are honestly, we're jealous. I mean, we're excited when our sermon is remembered the next Sunday. That's a good week. But this sermon really had an impact. Unfortunately, it was an impact that we think is highly problematic. And like I said, it's amazing that he says the quiet part out loud. This is Christian nationalism from the beginning, a way of stamping the nation as Christian and defining some Americans as not fully American because of their faith or lack thereof.
Yeah, Brian, you're teaching me something new here. I knew we always had like kind of Christmas and Easter Christians that only show up those 2 Sundays. Now you're telling me there's a whole nother category, which is the Lincoln birthday Christians, the presidents that only show up on Lincoln's birthday.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about, I mean, that sermon, right? The little bit you've quoted as we got the book together, what we read of it is, it would have, if it had been preached by David Barton, it wouldn't have surprised me, right? I mean, you're basically talking about being at a present day David Barton event or a Reawaken America tour rally where some of the rhetoric being preached as Christian is, again, this sort of really blatant Christian nationalism that instead was being spoken from a mainline pulpit in the nation's capital to the President of the United States.
And it's important to note the church is still proud of this legacy of having put God into the Pledge of Allegiance. Here's a plaque that's outside of the church. I took this picture a few months ago while in Washington, D.C. I think there must have been some graffiti that they had to clean off there up on the top part. And most of the plaque is describing itself in relations to their political influence. A reference to the White House in the first paragraph, a reference to presidents showing up, and Abraham Lincoln, right, being there. And that's why they have the Lincoln Pew there and the Lincoln Sunday Focus. And then they have a pastor who was a Senate chaplain, Peter Marshall. And then the next paragraph is about the sermon, the Under God sermon that gets it into the Pledge of Allegiance. And so this is part of our heritage as mainline Protestants, and we're still celebrating it today.
Indeed, another way to see this kind of history in action, right, is how we got the National Council of Churches of Christ in the USA when they first came together, this sort of ecumenical body that had a lot of leadership and belonging from the mainline Protestant churches. When it came together in 1950, they held their constituting convention, their initial stamp on who they were going to be. And the theme they gathered under was "This Nation Under God." So here we have a group that today we think of as a very progressive Christian witness, focused on social action, doing the work of combating Christian nationalism, that when it first came together was echoing some of those words we heard being preached from that pulpit at New York Presbyterian Church, right? This idea that here is all these Christians, and what united them was not their faith, was not their common work in pursuit of the gospel and its social teachings, was this idea that this nation that they belonged to was under God. And I can't imagine today the National Council of Churches having that theme when they gather for one of their meetings. I suspect that they would rebuke others who gathered under that theme from other traditions because they would see it as perpetuating Christian nationalism. And yet their very beginning was rooted in that ideology. It was there from the very present, from the very initial beginnings, and has continued right up to the present.
Yeah, and it's explicit in the sermons, in the messages, in the prayers, the songs that are sung. It's a gathering, espousing and pushing Christian nationalism and a vision of we are the cultural religious elites and we can run this country. So this does raise an important question. Why does this matter, right? It's not just the fact that the past is, is never dead. It's not even past. It's this idea that it does continue to impact us today, because Beau already mentioned David Barton. There are others who espouse and push Christian nationalism today, say a Tony Perkins or a Speaker Mike Johnson, who point to evidence from the past as proof that we're supposed to be a Christian nation, and thus as proof for why they should get to do and push the policies that they want. And so here's one example. This is an image that Speaker Mike Johnson, who is a textbook example of Christian nationalism today, coming from the white evangelical tradition. This is a picture he shared on social media the day that he was elected as speaker. He also pointed out that moment as well. This is above on the wall in gold letters on the House chamber. So when he was speaking after being elected, he's just below the American flag there. And he points to "In God We Trust." And he talks about that as important, right? This is his vision. We're supposed to be a Christian nation. Look, it's even stamped there on the House walls in gold letters, "In God We Trust." But where did that come from? And I'm sure by now you already know the answer of where we're going. Though those words are there in gold letters because of the work of mainline Protestant clergy and pastors. And so this was actually in response, this happened in response to the prayer in public schools Supreme Court decision in 1962. Several mainline Protestant politicians were upset. They disagreed with the Supreme Court decision. And that wall there used to just be a number of stars. And so they pushed the legislation to remove most of the stars and instead put "In God We Trust" there as a way of canceling out or rebuking the Supreme Court decision that you might be able to take prayer out of public schools, but we'll stamp God on the wall here in the House chamber. And that's why this matters. Because the evidence that Christian nationalists are pointing to today to justify their policies as they want to create a country governed by just a narrow slice of conservative evangelical Christianity, The quote evidence that they point to are things that mainline Protestants literally helped put there. And so it's important for mainline Protestants to reckon with that history, to reckon with that tradition, and to figure out how to make amends for what we stamped on our nation, sometimes very literally, as we see there on the House chamber wall.
Yeah, and I just can't say that enough, Brian. We want to blame others, right? Those evangelicals, those fundamentalists, those Trumpian Christians for this problem, because those are the current expressions we're seeing of it. We need to ask again, how did we get here? And while these have just been a few anecdotes, right? Under God and God we trust, the Truman Bible, they together reveal quite the story of mainline Protestants advancing Christian nationalism over the decades in a way that really helped create this moment that we're in right now. And I think it's really important that we know this past, that we know those stories, and that we really turn our attention to interrogating where this is still alive and present within our own tradition, because it's in our own tradition that we have a lot more influence over what happens relative to some of those other groups that don't care a whole lot what people like you and me think. But we do have influence within those congregations and denominations that we're a part of and that we still serve in, that are still, again, participating in this problem and haven't interrogated their past contributions to it.
So we started with a moment of Trump and the Bible. Let's end with a moment of Trump and the Bible, perhaps still the most infamous moment of Trump and the Bible. And we all know this. It happened 4 years ago, June 1st. And after peaceful Black Lives Matter protesters had been removed, there had been tear gas and police had gone through and removed people from the area outside the White House, including some Episcopal clergy who were on the property of St. John's Episcopal Church across the street. Trump marches across, holds up this Bible, doesn't really say anything, doesn't have remarks. Someone asks him, "Is that your Bible?" He responds, "It's a Bible." And then that's it. He answers a couple more questions and he's done. There was no reading, there was no prayer, there was no prepared speech. This was at the time said, oh, look, he's reaching out to his evangelical base. And it is true. Franklin Graham and Robert Jeffress and a number of other white evangelical leaders praised him, right? This proved that he was a strong Christian leader. Media headlines said this was a nod to his evangelical base. But if you look at this viral image, nothing in the image is evangelical. Everything that we see in this image is a product of the mainline Protestant tradition. There are basically three people or things there in this picture. There's the president, and I hate to say it, but Donald Trump is a product of the mainline Protestant tradition. He was confirmed in a Presbyterian church, married in Reform and Episcopal churches, identified at a Presbyterian as the time that he went into the White House. A few months after this, he left the Presbyterians officially and says he's now a non-denominational Christian. But at the moment that he's standing there, he's a lifelong mainline Protestant. The church, St. John's Episcopal, is not only an Episcopal church, it also is proud of its status as the, quote, Church of the Presidents. Other signs, this one's outside the parish house, they're just around the corner. The signs that are directly outside the church building itself note that every president of the United States since James Madison has attended services here. That's on the top of their signs. It's something they promote on their website. They have a pew reserved inside for the president in perpetuity. And just above the spot where Trump is standing today, if you walk by, you'll see U.S. and Episcopal church flags hanging there. And then the Bible. We've already talked about this Bible. Trump said it was a Bible, but pictures of the spine, and I will note, by the way, it's not actually being held upside down. I know he's holding it awkwardly, but he didn't actually hold it upside down. And some pictures of the spine show that it's a revised standard version of the Bible. That translation that the National Council of Churches created and gave the very first copy to President Truman there at the White House, that's the Bible that Trump is holding up. So we have a mainline Protestant president in front of a mainline Protestant church holding up a mainline Protestant Bible. This is the political timeline that mainline Protestants, unfortunately, helped create.
Indeed, it's a sad reality when we think about it, but it is a reality. And now we need to think about what we can do about it in this present moment. And that'll be the topic of our next lecture.